Hey guys, welcome back to video 6 for week 9. So we're going to wrap it up here for the end of the week. We did have quite a big week this week, so we learnt quite a bit. We learnt about the compressor, the limiter, the drum bus. We also learnt what sends and returns are, and also what all these controls in here are for the individual tracks. We've learnt about the track delays, so that if we wanted to tweak timing afterwards, we can do that to the overall track. I didn't actually do that in my Mixdown because I don't feel like it needed it anywhere, but the option is there if you want to use it. We also learnt about side chaining, so using the compressor in that way, and then how to EQ for our Mixdown, how to compress for our Mixdown, and then also using a bit of the limiter there to chop off any harsh volume peaks. But just to make a note on that, don't go too hard with the limiter. You don't want to be completely crushing your track, because if you completely crush the track, it's not going to sound very dynamic once you get to the final stage of mastering. You do want to keep some of those, those volume changes and those subtle and loud parts of your track. If everything's just over limited and over compressed, it can sound completely squashed and everything will sound the same. So there'll be no volume shifts. It'll be all quite linear. You won't get those ups and downs like how you have the chorus with more energy and then the breaks a little bit quieter and more subtle. If you over limit and over compress everything, it's going to get to the point where it all just sounds the same no matter what part of the track you're in. So do keep that in mind when you are doing your Mixdowns. This process is quite technical and it does take a bit of time to get right. I remember when I first started producing, this was always one of the hardest steps for me, is to actually make my tracks sound clean. And back when I started, the samples weren't as good as they are today. So it helps that things have progressed quite a bit, especially with Splice. A lot of the stuff that you get off Splice will be very high quality to begin with. So you won't need to do as much messing around as there used to be, but you do still have to make sure your sound's working together. So you still have to go through this process. It just helps if you're using a better bass to start with. We also looked at panning our sounds left and right. So we have that technique up our sleeve as well. So if you have some sounds that complement each other, like I was showing in the previous example, so not what I did here, but with the hi-hats and the drums, or the percussion, sorry, you can pan those to separate ears so that you have quite an interesting effect when you listen to it. And that's what we're trying to get at the end of the day, is just to make our track as interesting as it can be, so that the listener stays engaged and people want to actually listen to our music. Now on panning, things that you don't want to pan are your kick, your bass, and yeah, I'd say those two are the most important things that you'd never want to pan, because those two things, obviously it depends on the type of genre that you're making as well, but typically in pretty much all music, your kick and your bass are going to want to be as centered as possible. So they're pretty much going to be mono. We're going to cover this a little bit more next week, but essentially what I mean by that is, by mono, is that the kick and the bass will be exactly the same on your left and right ear. So there's no difference at all. There's no stereo information. It'll just be completely centered and everything will be identical on the left and right channel. And you want that because when you're listening to a kick and a bass, doesn't matter where you are, if you're on some speakers or you're in a car or you're in a club or you're at a festival, you're at a gig, whatever it might be, you want the kick and bass to be quite prominent no matter where you're standing. So you don't want those two sounds shifting around left and right like the hi-hats or the percussion. So you can almost use this as an example if we open up this EQ. Essentially, sounds down here we want to be more mono. And then the further we move up here towards the right, so we're going higher in the frequencies, the more we can start to push those sounds out to the side, like those hi-hats, those percussions. I did it a little bit with those synths as well. They were sitting around here. It's just down here where you want to keep everything quite mono. Because it's not going to be good for the listener if, let's say you're listening to it on a very big speaker system with multiple speakers, and you have your kick and your bass swirling around between left and right. That means half the room or half the people at the gig aren't going to be able to hear those sounds, and then the other half are going to be able to hear it quite strongly. So you definitely want these sounds to be heard no matter where people are. And then it translates down to your phones as well. Because phone speakers are still mono, or most of them are anyway. I don't think I know of any stereo phone speakers, but When people listen through their phones, you want to make sure that the main sounds are coming out. If you have them swirling between left and right, you're not going to really be able to hear them once you translate it down to a mono speaker. We are going to cover this in the mastering stage, but I just thought I'd let you know now so you don't start pushing all these out to the left and right and have your kick in the left ear and your bass in the right ear or something crazy like that. Just want to make sure I addressed it now. So yeah, with the drums, you can export them separately like this, and then you can group them, or another term that's used in music production world is bussing. So essentially we've bussed all the drums, and we have a drum bus here, which we affect all the drums at once with these two plugins. So if you hear the term bussing, that's essentially what this is. And you can do this with any sounds that sit in a similar space. So if I had multiple hi-hats, like an open and a closed, and different types of hi-hats, I could group them all together. I could have all my percussion together, whether it be toms or Congo drums, whatever it might be, I can group them. And yeah, it just sounds that are similar. So here I had my two synths, two plucks that were very similar. I grouped them together, and then I put some processing on there as well. And same thing with your effects, you can group all those. Like I mentioned, you can separate them if you have a boom effect and some noise effects. That way you can start to separate them based on where they are in the frequency range. So your booms and your impacts are typically going to be down here, so you can group them together. That way you can process them on their own. And then you can group all the noise ones, which are going to sit up here in another group. But for this example, I just had them all in one. But yeah, when you're going through this process, just use your ears, use your best judgment. When you dip down the volumes at the very beginning, like that process we went through of dragging them all so that we heard nothing, and then we drag them all up one by one, just by ear. Make sure you don't look at the screen or anything, just use your ears. That way you're not going to be influenced by any numbers. That way you're not watching these numbers while you're dragging it up. So if you have to close your eyes, do that. Otherwise, just look away from the screen and slowly drag it up until it sounds right to you. And also when you do this whole mixdown process, make sure you do it with fresh ears. So, first thing in the morning is a really good example. Or even just take a couple of days off or a few days off from listening to this track. And then you can come back to it in a few days with a completely fresh perspective and fresh ears. And then you can start the mixdown process. And that way, when you pull these volume levels up, you might find that things sound better where they are now instead of how you had them when you made the track. You might even come back to it after a few days and be like, all right, this doesn't actually sound that good. And I've done that so many times, so don't feel bad if you do end up doing that. A lot of the time, especially with production, we get stuck in a loop, and we kind of, obviously you're listening to the same track over and over again because you're making it, and you have to hear some parts over and over again. And we really get stuck in our ways. So taking a little break, whether it be even just overnight if you have to, and then come back to this in the morning with fresh ears. Before you listen to any music or before you listen to this song at all, do this first thing in the morning, and that way you have a completely fresh perspective. Or if you have to, take a few days off. So this definitely isn't something you want to do at 1 a.m. in the morning after you've been working all night on the track, and then you want to start the mixdown process because your ears are so fatigued by that stage that you're probably going to do it and then listen to it in the morning and be like, what the hell was I thinking? And that applies to the creative process as well. So many times I've made a track late at night and I thought it was just the best thing I've ever made, and then I listened to it the next morning and I was like, wow, that's pretty crap. So just a couple of tips there when it comes to mixdown and production in general. But I'll leave the video here. I've dragged you guys on long enough for week 9. I did throw quite a bit on you this week, but I wanted to leave it till this stage because if I tried to do it earlier on, it would just be too much, especially since you're learning the whole other process of music production. So now that you have you're a bit more comfortable with making music, now is kind of the time where I introduce you to all these little things. So next week, sadly, we are going to be finishing off the course. It's going to be week 10. And we'll be covering mastering. So that's the final stage of music production, is mastering, exporting. And then I'll also be showing you a couple of techniques, like handy little tricks that I use production-wise. So we're going through those. Just some cool effects and stuff that you can use. I'm going to cover some plugins that you might find helpful for after you finish this course and you want to progress and do more things with music production. Those are going to help as well. Clearly, as we've seen so far, we don't need third-party plugins to make music, but there are a few really, really handy ones that sound nice that do help. So I will mention those. And I'll also jump into vocal processing a little more in depth. So I know we covered basic cleanup with the gate and auto tuning inside of Ableton. I'm actually going to jump into how we would process vocals to use on a track. So the effects side of it. Now that we know all these effects, we can put them into use on some vocals. So yeah, I hope you're ready for the last week. Just spend this week going through this process. So actually doing a mix down on your track. Even if you haven't completely finished the track, just do it anyway and wherever you're at. Because like me, I haven't actually finished this track. There's no outro, nothing. I just made this as an example. But if you haven't done a complete track, just do this process on whatever you've got. That way you can actually get the experience from going through this. And while it's fresh in your head, otherwise, you might come back to it later and forget some stuff. And yeah, that's pretty much it for week 9. So it's been a big week. Make sure you rest up. Take a little time off if you have to from production and Ableton. I'm sure you're juggling this amongst some other things, whether it be work or study, whatever. So yeah, just enjoy your week, enjoy your weekend, get through this as much as you can. And then next week, we're going to finally finish off our tracks and we're going to finish off the course. So I'll see you all when we return in week 10.